and the BDS movement. So right now I'll turn things over to Judge Kozinski, who will begin the program today by asking the first respondent to discuss the issue of the politics of impeachment. Who'd like to begin?
Professor Dershowitz, you have the floor.
Well, I'm happy to begin. I'm a liberal Democrat who voted for all the people that Bob worked for. My political mentors in many ways were Ted Kennedy. I worked on the McGovern campaign. I worked on all the Democratic campaigns. I worked hard for the election of Hillary Clinton. I worked hard for the defeat of President Donald Trump in an election, but I strongly, strongly, strongly opposed his impeachment. I believe that duly elected president should be removed from office only when there is a broad-based consensus and bipartisan support for impeachment and removal. The only president in American history who was properly subject to impeachment was Richard Nixon, and it never came to that because it was so clear that he had committed impeachable offenses that he voluntarily, or maybe not so voluntarily, resigned. Andrew Johnson was improperly impeached. Bill Clinton was improperly impeached. I, in fact, was part of the Bill Clinton defense team and testified in front of Congress against his impeachment. I was the only person who spoke in the Senate against the impeachment of Donald Trump, who also spoke against the impeachment of Bill Clinton. In fact, the only other time I was on the Senate floor was when I stood up and defended Alan Cranston, the great liberal Democratic senator of California. And so for me, impeachment is never and should never be a partisan issue. I think everybody has to pass what I call the shoe on the other foot test. And what I asked the senators to do, I said to each of them, please imagine that the person being impeached was of the opposite party and you were of the opposite party. And ask yourself what neutral principles would justify impeachment. And then I went through what one of my rabbis called a Talmudic dialogue about the 6 words that were the subject of the debate on the Senate floor. The 6 words were, and other high crimes, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. Everybody knows what treason means. It's in the Constitution. Everybody knows what bribery means. It's a common term that had a meaning at common law at the time the Constitution was written. But what does or other high crimes and misdemeanors mean? Well, obviously, there is the simple facial meaning of the term. When you have 2 words, treason and bribery, and then the word other and other high crimes and misdemeanors, the word other requires that crimes and misdemeanors be akin to treason and bribery. That's the obvious intended meaning. So that high crimes, we know that means crimes like extortion, crimes like bribery, crimes like perjury, which Bill Clinton was accused of committing. And what about misdemeanors? Well, you go back and you look at what misdemeanors meant at common law. Misdemeanors were a species of crime. They were a crime. At common law, there was something called a capital misdemeanor. You could actually be executed for committing a misdemeanor. That's how serious misdemeanors were. And so there's a heavy, heavy burden of proof on those who would defy the plain meaning of the terms or of the high crimes and misdemeanors. And what happened is a bunch of sophists on the other side, led by the Democratic leaders, tried to give an interpretation of those words that was simply partisan. Partisan in effect and partisan in intent. What they said was, well, misdemeanors means what it meant when the British impeached people, forgetting that the British never impeached a prime minister, never impeached a king, never impeached anybody at a very important level. Impeachment was used in England for very low-level or medium-level administrators. And then when the framers tried to introduce the British system through the use of the term maladministration, which one of the framers said, let's make that a criteria for impeachment, Madison said, no, we can't do that. That would turn the United States, a republic, into a British-style parliamentary democracy where a president serves at the pleasure of the legislature. Remember, in Great Britain and Israel, the president or the prime minister, the head of state, can be thrown out of office by a simple majority vote of the parliament. And Madison said, we don't want that in this country. We want a strong executive, not an executive subject to the whim or pleasure of the legislature. The argument was overwhelming in its logic, overwhelming in its historical basis, overwhelming in its epistemology, and yet virtually every professor in the United States rejected that argument. Larry Tribe called it bonkers. Others said I was becoming senile for making that argument. And yet, if it had been President Hillary Clinton and she had been impeached on the same ground, every single one of those professors would have told me how brilliant I was, and they would have built a statue to me on Martha's Vineyard. It was such blatant hypocrisy for them suddenly to switch sides. In the 19th century, when Johnson was impeached, the dean of the Columbia Law School said, of course you need a crime. The weight of authority is on the side of a crime. The former justice of the Supreme Court who defended Johnson said, of course you need a crime. But even if I'm wrong, even if history were to support the other side, the idea that we don't have a debate about this, that it just results in name-calling, that thousands of professors, most of whom have no idea what they're talking about, are prepared to sign a petition saying that my views are wrong. A bunch of professors led by your congressmen in this area, and led by congressmen in New York and by Schumer, actually got up on the floor of the Senate and said that I was not a constitutional law expert. Having taught constitutional procedure as part of criminal procedure for 50 years, having litigated over 100 constitutional cases, having written dozens of articles and books about the Constitution, they claimed I was not a constitutional expert because I came out on the wrong side of the issue. If I had been defending Hillary Clinton, they would have been praising my constitutional expertise. And then just one more point, and then I'll sit down. The worst offenders were the two congressmen, plus Senator Schumer, but the worst offender was CNN. Let me explain why. And I'm going to ask for your advice. I'm going to ask for your advice here tonight. Here's what happened. Ted Cruz, through the Chief Justice, asked me a very simple question. What about quid pro quo? Is that an impeachable offense? And here's my full answer. And you can see it online. You can hear it. You can see it, not on CNN. You can see it on any honest channel. Here was my answer. I said, I'm very honored to have just come back from the White House, where I saw the unrolling of the peace plan. I said, what if in the peace plan, I gave a whole series of hypotheticals, what if in the peace plan the Israelis were told that unless you stop the settlements, you're not getting any money? That would be a quid pro quo. Or the Palestinians were told, unless you stop terrorism, you're not going to get any money. That would all be quid pro quo. There's nothing wrong with a quid pro quo unless it involves something that's illegal. But if it's illegal, then a quid pro quo is impeachable. If it involves corrupt conduct, if it involves self-dealing, if it involves a kickback, then it would be illegal. But if it was not anything illegal, the mere fact that a public figure, and I didn't limit it to the president, any member of Congress, any elected official, had a mixed motive and was thinking not only about the public interest, but about his own electoral interest, that mixed motive could not be subject to an impeachment without any illegal conduct. So here's what CNN said. They took it out of context. They eliminated the part about criminal. They eliminated the part about corrupt. And they said, Dershowitz said, if a president thinks his election is in the national interest, he can do anything, including shoot his opponent, rig the machines. And this was your friend Paul Bagalia who said that. And CNN simply doctored the interview. It was as if I said the following: let me tell you what I don't believe. I don't believe a president can do anything. And CNN puts on, a president can do anything, Dershowitz said, leaving out, I don't believe. So my question to you is this, and I leave you with this question. I am a First Amendment believer. I was one of the law clerks who wrote the opinions in New York Times versus Sullivan, but I do not believe the First Amendment protects a willful, deliberate, malicious doctoring of a tape to make somebody say something exact opposite of what he said. So my question to you is, should I sue CNN?
Whatever you're comfortable with. I must express my admiration for Professor Dershowitz. He left just enough time within his time to allow for the standing ovation. Professor Shrum?
I expect every bit as many standing ovations. I'm a little doubtful about that because before the event, I was in the holding room, and the reception, well, I'm going to have to move it out then.
Here. You got it?
Got it. I was in the holding room, and there were all these Trump for President buttons there. And there was all these pamphlets from the Republican Jewish Coalition. So I don't think I'm exactly at home. I'm on the West Side. I'm in Beverly Hills. I think you're kind of an atypical crowd for this part of town. I also have some bad news for Professor Dershowitz and for those of you who applauded him. Adam Schiff will get reelected to Congress by a record margin. We're going to talk about civility a little bit later, but I think that's an undisputable fact. Secondly, it was interesting to me, and I'm not going to argue the legal case at length with Alan Dershowitz. I'm in no position to do that. I went to Harvard Law. Thank you. That was kind. I went to Harvard Law School. And the only thing I did of any note was win the Ames competition, which is the moot court competition. I would note that on these legal issues, and I was told we were going to talk about the political implications of impeachment, which I'm going to talk about. Alan sort of, I think, rehearsed his speech to the Senate and then added an attack on CNN. He did note that a lot of people disagreed with him. The exact quote from the New York Times is, "Most of the scholars disagree with me. I think they're wrong." I think they're right. And we could have a debate about that. But I don't think it's fair, for example, to question the motives of people to the extent of saying that if Hillary Clinton had been impeached for doing what Donald Trump did, all those people would have necessarily been on the other side. I think when you start using lines, I'm sorry, guys, you may not want to hear it, but you're not going to like what you hear in November from the voters either. I think...
Professor Shrum, I'm going to jump in.
I'm perfectly
let's
happy.
keep it civil, please.
I was going to say, I'm perfectly happy to have a civil discussion here, and I do think we should not use words like hypocrisy. We should not use words like questioning people's motives. And I do not think that it advances public dialogue to join President Trump in quoting CNN and in trashing CNN. And Alan, my advice to you as a non-practicing lawyer would be don't sue them, you'll lose. Now, during the impeachment trial, and this is the quote I think you were talking about, and I think I have, what do you want? I have no idea what you're talking about, and I may be the better for it.
Please, let's have some civility. This is rude. We're here to listen and learn. I apologize.
No problem. I sort of knew coming in here that this was going to be like this, but Lisa Korbatoff asked me to do it, so I said I'd do it.
I'd do anything for Lisa myself, so...
Anyway, I think this
I'm giving you an extra 2 minutes.
I don't need it. I think this is the exact quote from Professor Dershowitz. If a president does something which he believes will help him get elected in the public interest, that cannot be the kind of quid pro quo that results in impeachment. Now, he's parsed that statement now, or he's explained that statement, but I think it's profoundly off base. In fact, earlier, when he used the word extortion as a grounds for impeachment, I think what the president did to the Ukrainians was exactly extortion. But beyond that, he argued that mere abuse of power was not a grounds for impeachment. Well, what if a president started a conflict in October of the election year to get reelected? He has war-making powers, and evidence came out that his motive was purely political. He would have had the power, but he would have abused the power. It's exactly, in my view, what should be impeachable. Now I want to talk about the aftermath of all this. If you decide that a president who obstructs justice can't be indicted and a president who abuses power can't be impeached, then you give the president a license to engage in wholesale abuse. Since the trial, that's what Donald Trump has done. We've seen that with Roger Stone. We've seen that with the purging of law enforcement officials. And, you know, I think there are some people who agreed with me, and they actually listened to Professor Dershowitz. I'm perfectly happy to take any of your questions at any point. I'm perfectly happy to debate any of you, but I'm going to make my case. We've seen the purging of law enforcement officials and others who testified in the impeachment proceedings, demands for a re-examination of the Flynn case, a statement that he has the right to interfere in Justice Department criminal cases. And I saw an interview that Professor Dershowitz gave on Breitbart Radio where he said, well, Obama did this, and I hold in my hand a 302 that indicates that there's going to be a lawsuit about this. But he didn't say what the lawsuit was, gave no evidence. We don't know what would be in that lawsuit. And it reminds me of Joseph McCarthy going to Wheeling, West Virginia and saying, I hold in my hands the names of 200 officials in the State Department who have communist ties.
So we're not questioning motives, but we're calling me McCarthy. That's really good.
No, I didn't call you McCarthy. Yes, I said that was a McCarthyite tactic. What's the case?
You will find out about it very soon.
Oh, isn't that great?
Yeah, it is very great because
why don't you go on
I have a client to represent who has not given me the authority to disclose the specifics. But I will disclose the specifics, which McCarthy didn't do. I have a 302, which I will be happy to show you, which pinpoints the fact that the President of the United States started the investigation. You may not like it, but it's not McCarthyism.
He says this was done on behalf of George Soros. That is one of the worst right-wing memes that we have going around this country today.
But it's true.
Yeah. You know what? Alan, you and Donald Trump are under the mistaken assumption that if you believe something, it's true. This actually has to be settled in a court of law.
It will.
And you'll lose. Politically, what are the consequences of all this? In the Quinnipiac poll, 55 to 40 voters say acquittal did not clear Trump of wrongdoing. Among independents, it's 55 to 40. The president's approval is at 43%. It has not budged since, I'm sorry. I know, so you're going to cite the Gallup poll. So in the Real Clear Politics average, his approval is at 45%.
They want you to talk into the mic.
Into the mic? In the Reuters Ipsos poll, 49% of people agreed that impeachment was the right thing to do, and only 41% disagree. Only 39% thought the president was innocent of the charges brought against him. So I'd like to look at that in terms of the 2020 election. And first I would cite the Clinton precedent and what happened in the year 2000. After that impeachment, after the trial, after he was acquitted, he had a very high job approval, and he had a very low personal approval. And if you went out and talked to focus groups, they just wanted it all to be gone. Their kids had seen things on television they didn't want them to see. That opened the way for George W. Bush, and I'm sure the people in the Republican coalition here won't mind this, to run on the proposition that he was going to change very little. He was going to have a tax cut to share the prosperity, but he was going to preserve the budget surplus. But he would restore honor and dignity to the White House. That was all about the Clinton impeachment. I think the same overhang is likely for Trump. He's the only president since polling began never to be above 50% approval. And I think impeachment reinforces the public reaction to a pattern of continuing presidential misconduct. He's actually broken the historic connection so far between approval on the economy and job approval in general. There's about a 20% higher job approval for him on the economy than there is job approval in general. I'll conclude by saying my view is that Trump can't win the election. But the Democrats can lose the election. Do you do this at synagogue every week? Actually, for example, the health care question and Medicare for all. Medicare for all could invert the Democratic advantage on health care, where issues like pre-existing conditions helped drive a Democratic victory in 2018. Trump will run a scorched earth campaign against the Democratic nominee, and if that nominee's positions or record repel voters otherwise to incline to vote Democratic, Trump could be reelected. Not for his virtues, if I can use that word, but because the Democrats once again lose the unlosable election.
Professor Dershowitz get a chance to respond. I know you have a number of things to respond to, but I have a question.
Sure, please.
You might be able to work in because I didn't understand.
Yeah.
You made a distinction between the impeachment of President Clinton,
Yeah.
whom you defended,
Yeah.
and President Trump, whom you defended.
Right.
And again, this is a question. This is not a
Right, sure,
challenge.
sure.
What President Clinton was accused of doing was, in fact, a felony.
That's right.
And I am just wondering, under your
Right.
theory of
Yeah, I had a very simple answer. It was
of what is
yeah.
impeachable or not. Why is that not impeachable?
Because the Constitution says high crime. What Clinton did was a low crime. It was a crime of personal misconduct, not a crime of governmental misconduct. It was much like what happened to Alexander Hamilton. Alexander Hamilton, you may remember, if you're a scholar of history or if you've seen the play, remember, was seduced by a woman while he was Secretary of the Treasury. And the woman's husband then came and demanded extortionate payments, which he paid. Those were not impeachable offenses, although adultery was a felony at the time. But then the extortionist went over to Hamilton and said, unless you pay me more money, I will say you got the money from the Treasury Department, and use that money to pay the extortion. And of course, he didn't get the money from the Treasury Department, and he issued a pamphlet, which was very embarrassing to him and his family, in which he admitted the affair, admitted the extortion, but said he paid the money personally. Actually, he paid the money from his wife's funds, which made it ironic, of course. You know, all the framers had one thing in common. They all married very rich women, and he was one of them, and his wife didn't know she was paying extortion money. But the point is, Clinton committed a low crime. But I want to throw a question back at my distinguished opponent. I want to ask you this question very directly. If a public official, an elected official, says to himself, you know, I want to take an action, I want to vote in a certain way, I think it will help the national interest, but I think it will also help my election. Is that a crime or an impeachable offense? It's a rhetorical question, because of course it's not. That's exactly what I said. And Mr. Shrum, you have totally distorted what I said. Let me read you what I said.
I think I quoted you.
No, you didn't. You did. No, you didn't. What you did is you left out the words before and the words after. You quoted me as saying, this is what I don't believe, a president can do anything. And you quoted me as saying a president can do anything. You did exactly what CNN did. You left out the following words: if the quid pro quo were illegal. You deliberately left out those words. And if you put those words in, what it says is, if a president does something illegal, if I had said that, which he believes will help him get elected, that would be the issue. Now, what I said was, if a president does something perfectly legal, which he believes will get him elected, that cannot be the kind of quid pro quo that results in impeachment. Shame on you for repeating the sin of CNN. You may have persuaded me because you're an honest and decent man whose motives I won't challenge, but because you have indulged in the same kind of gutter politics as CNN has, then I may very well have to sue CNN to make sure that people like you can never repeat the canard that I said a president can do anything. I challenge you to read my entire quote to the audience, not do what CNN did. Go ahead, here's the quote, the whole quote. Read it. Not just the excerpt, read the quote.
I'm going to say several, no. Listen, guys, we can either have a discussion and we can be civil, which Alan just was not, or I can respond in kind. I find it shameful that someone I admired for years represented the single most reprehensible person ever to sit in the Oval Office as President of the United States. Secondly,
talk about McCarthyism.
You know, Alan, I'm going to talk. I didn't interrupt you. Don't interrupt me. Secondly, when you listen to his explanation about that quote, I defy anybody in this audience to figure out what the hell he was saying. The quote says, and it's exact, if a president does something which he believes will help him get elected in the public interest, that cannot be the kind of quid pro quo that results in impeachment. I know what he's saying. He's saying he has to commit a crime. I don't agree with that. I don't think that President Clinton should have been impeached at all. I don't think high crimes and misdemeanors means crimes in the conventional sense. And I think if abuse of power is not an impeachable offense, then democracy in this country is in terrible, terrible trouble. Obviously, the rhetorical question that Alan asked, if a public official says to himself, I'm going to vote this way because I'm going to get myself reelected and that's in the national interest, obviously that's not an impeachable offense.
That's exactly what I said.
You know, exactly. Alan, would you like to have the stage to yourself? I think you love it. I think you love it. So let me finish.
I'd like to hear truth from the other side.
No, Alan, you know, you think you have the truth.
I do.
Just like Donald Trump thinks he has the truth.
McCarthyism.
But you know what? You don't get to decide. So either be quiet or I'm not going to say a word. Okay? We can have a dialogue.
That's your choice.
We can have a dialogue. No, your choice is to shut up, and maybe Judge Kozinski can maybe get you to shut up.
So let me
My final
you.
point, which I was making, and I don't think in the balance of time that there's any inequity here. In fact, if there is, it's on the other side of this podium. If a public official does that, it's, you know, I don't think it's an impeachable offense. But if Congress has appropriated money that is supposed to go to Ukraine for its military defense, and the president withholds that money, and the signals are sent to the Ukrainians that they're not going to release it until there's an investigation of Joe and Hunter Biden, I think that's an impeachable offense.
Okay, let's just remember one thing that Shrum said, and that is that it's despicable that I was the lawyer for the President of the United States. That is the most McCarthyite statement I've heard. I grew up during McCarthyism, when lawyers were held responsible for their clients. The next thing he's going to say is that it was despicable that I represented Michael Milken. It was despicable that I represented Natan Sharansky. It's despicable that I'm trying to help Benjamin Netanyahu.
I agree with, by the way.
So McCarthyism squared. Now it's despicable that a lawyer represents Benjamin Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel. It's despicable that a lawyer represents the President of the United States. That's a new meaning to McCarthyism.
I think Rabbi Baron is reclaiming the stage. We promised you an exciting debate, and I think you got it. Let's have a round of applause for both of the participants.
Thank you, Judge Kozinski.